couple millions of times. But personally, I've actually been a little embarrassed to ask, what exactly are they? So first things first. The word fjord is spelled like this, but we pronounce it as fjord. Now, in Scandinavian languages, the J is often pronounced like a Y or a U. And fjords, they are long, narrow, deep-sea inlets that are surrounded by massive cliffs. Now, I always thought that fjords referred to just the rocky part, but it's actually the entire package. In general, fjords were created by glaciers. Now, the ice of the glacier, it carves out over the stone, and then over thousands of years, as the glaciers retreat, the water fills in the empty space, leaving behind these unbelievable natural wonders behind. Now, fjords, they are so significant to the landscape, Norwegians, well, they have sort of invented the word. Fjord comes from the Norse verb ferd, which means traveling, which is also where we get the word ferry. So in other words, fjords were so important to the Vikings that these massive wonders were literally synonymous with day-to-day traveling. That brings us to the Vikings. Now I'm sure most of you have heard of them, right? Well, forget the image of funny hats and groups of bearded men that drink mead out of horns screaming, "Arr!" while pillaging the countryside. There's actually far more to the Vikings than pop culture actually suggests. Now, the Vikings, they were master seafarers and survivalists because that's what the landscape actually required. Take, for example, the Vikings, they were incredible shipbuilders because they had to be, because you got the unstable Arctic climate, which made farming very difficult. So they built ships to fish, trade, and of course to pillage. Now the Viking longships, they were actually marvels of engineering. They were sleek, flexible, light, and fast. And they were also balanced in such a way that they were stable enough to sail in open ocean, and yet agile enough to navigate the narrow fjords. And P.S. That navigation made sneaking up on villages that they wanted to pillage very, very easy. Now the Vikings, they were also incredible navigators. Now no one really knows how they were able to sail across the Atlantic and even become the first Europeans to land in America. But evidence does suggest they used tools like sunstones, which was a calcite crystal that identified your location based on the position of the sun. So imagine this. If Google Maps ran off of crystals, you turn left at that shiny point over there, and you're definitely near the Starbucks. Perfect, isn't it? Now, historians, they also think that they used the presence of birds and whales to determine their position at sea. That's all very, very impressive, and not to brag, but sometimes I kind of do the same thing, because I know I'm in the suburbs when I see a lot of labradoodles. Cute, isn't it? But look, however they did it, the lessons of the Vikings, well, they're still in use even today. In many ways, the ship you are sitting on right now actually has parts that are derived from Viking technology. For instance, the Vikings actually invented the keel. So, you see the structural beam that runs from the ship's bow to its stern? Well, think of it like the spine of the ship. The keel actually stabilizes the Viking ship and this ship, even through high speeds. And without it, this cruise would be a lot rockier. So take a moment right now and thank the Vikings for this one. Now, all this technology, this started because the people of Norway, well, they had to learn how to work with the environment, to navigate fjords and oceans, and to travel through the snowy mountainous land. And in the case of Snowshoe Thompson, to deliver the mail. And this tradition, well, it continues to this day. If you just spend a few hours here, you'll discover that Norway has a truly symbiotic relationship with their land. And in building a partnership with the land, well, they have tackled some of the biggest problems in the world. Now, throughout the region, from dikes in the Netherlands to the incredible bridge connecting Sweden to Denmark, people have found unbelievable ways to work within this majestic landscape. And today, we will discuss 2 projects that highlight the lengths people have to go to just to live in this amazing region. We're going to start in Norway. Now, as I mentioned before, Norway, it's rugged. So getting across the land has never been easy. And this is what it used to be like to drive from Oslo to Bergen, 2 of the biggest cities in Norway. Now, first of all, there was a ferry. And then you had to travel endless winding roads along the fjords, which is lovely scenery, but in the winter there's risk of landslides and avalanches. Now, a storm, it could knock out travel for days. And these are 2 major cities, and they're only about 200 miles or 320 kilometers away from each other. But yet, in the wrong circumstances, they were effectively cut off from one another. Now, in fact, all of Norway, it used to be so isolated during the winter that sometimes towns would be completely cut off from the rest of the country. Now, neighbors that lived less than a mile away could have had a giant fjord between them, and they never meet. So imagine traversing a huge gorge just to ask for a cup of sugar from your neighbor. Probably not going to happen. But here's Gunnar Jensen, and he's going to explain it to us.
These valleys between the mountains were so isolated that you could see genetic differences, really, because they didn't relate to each other. They had to go, they didn't go over the mountain to find a girl.
So, tired of isolation and, maybe to expand the dating pool, Norway decided to connect their land. And how did they do that, you may ask? Well, they built tunnels, and a lot of them. There are about 1,400 road tunnels in Norway. And for comparison, there are only about 500 in the US, which is about 25 times the size of Norway. So yes, that is a lot of tunnels. And in 1992, the Norwegian government, they introduced their most ambitious tunnel project yet to connect their country. And this was called the Lardal Tunnel, a massive road tunnel which runs from Lardal to Årland, a mountainous area packed with fjords and one of the main routes connecting Oslo with Bergen. Now, the tunnel was going to be 15 miles long, making it the longest road tunnel ever built. Now, 15 miles may seem short, but just consider this. In 2019, our home city of Seattle opened the longest tunnel in the United States to great fanfare and drama. Now, the project, it cost over $3 billion. And it took about 6 years of construction to complete, and it's only 2 miles long. Yes, now compare that with the 15-mile Lardal Tunnel, which only cost a little over $100 million USD and was constructed in just 5 years. So I'm not particularly good with math, but I'm pretty sure that 100 million is less than 3 billion. So yes, 15 miles is a lot. And there are a ton of challenges that actually come with making a tunnel this long. For example, if you're like me, you're probably thinking, no thank you. Tunnels, for me, a little freaky. I'd rather not volunteer to spend 20 minutes inside of one. And honestly, I am not alone in my tunnel phobia. People typically don't like tunnels, and for the most part, they don't like them at all, and that actually brings us to Gunnar. Now, he is actually our resident tunnel expert. And luckily for us, Gunnar, he is not like most people.
I love tunnels also because it's a way of communication between places, takes you swiftly from A to B, and if you edit it like a good film, it's also a good experience.
Now, Gunnar, he's a psychologist. you actually focus on transportation safety and specifically with tunnels. So why exactly would you need a psychologist to build a tunnel? Well, it all comes back to that thing he just said about editing the tunnel like a good film. And we're going to explain that in a second. But remember, it's a huge part of his work. So we're going to start at the very beginning. Now, Gunnar was brought onto the Lardal Tunnel project to do some digging. Get that? Pun? Digging? Don't worry, there are going to be more jokes. You'll get the more opportunity to get them. So, into the reasons why people hate tunnels and what makes them so hazardous. And this project was actually one of the first studies of its kind. So Gunnar, he actually had to start from scratch. Now, the first thing he found was that people, they get bored, and boredom isn't a great thing when you're driving in a tunnel. For example, he looked at what happened in the Gotthard Tunnel in Switzerland, which is about 10 miles long.
In the Gotthard Tunnel, they had 4 lethal accidents after 4 years in operation due to people falling asleep behind the wheel. So we saw that was a problem.
Yes. So you know that thing that happens when you're driving along and suddenly you realize you don't actually remember driving for those last few minutes? Well, that is actually a very real thing called highway hypnosis. And obviously, it can be very dangerous. People slip into this dream state, and they're not quite asleep, but they're totally not quite alert or aware of their surroundings. And in a tunnel, that state can be triggered very quickly in a very unusual way.
You have the flashing lights of the light fixtures in the roof, which reflect on your windscreen or the bonnet, and that's rhythmic. And when that matches the resting rhythm of your heart, then you get into that trance-like, sleep-inducing state of mind.
So in other words, the tunnels themselves were putting people to sleep. But for those that weren't falling asleep, there was also another danger.
And we also saw that people had anxiety for tunnels. Tunnel phobia is real. When you have anxiety for something, you don't know what's triggering it. You don't know why, but you feel it by mental stress and by sweating, by gripping the handle, the steering wheel harder. And many freeze in that situation. Occasionally you panic, and then you push the gas pedal to the bottom and drive as fast as you can through the tunnel.
So we're going to recap. They discovered that 1, people get bored in tunnels, lost orientation, and were more prone to falling asleep. And that the tunnels themselves weren't helping. Now, number 2, people feel anxious in tunnels. And when you're anxious, you tend to make very bad decisions like driving much more recklessly. So that leaves us the question, why are people actually getting so anxious in tunnels? And the main answer is simple, because there's no way out. So what did they decide to do? Now remember that thing he said earlier about editing a tunnel like a good film? Well, it turns out that was basically all they had to do. Put in a few cuts in the film of the tunnel to make it feel less tunnely. I know, good word. But they made 3 caverns, and that they distributed all along the length of the tunnel. And they hoped that these caverns would take care of a lot of the problems. For the anxious people, the caverns would give them an option to turn around if they wanted to get out. And for the rest of us, they would also break up the trip and act as mile markers, which helps reduce boredom and orient drivers. But it's not enough just to come up with a good idea. You actually have to test it. Now, you can't exactly test solutions for a tunnel that hasn't been built yet. So Gunnar, well, he came up with the next best thing, a simulator. So you know those driving games you used to play as a kid? Well, this is basically a hyper-realistic version of it.
This driving simulator is a real car. We have also one for truck driving, and it's with big screens that you see the whole scenery. There's also movement in the car, and we measure all kinds of things We measure eye tracking, we measure steering precision, speed, braking, etc.
So by putting people in the simulator, Gunnar was able to discover that just having the caverns actually helped, but it wasn't quite enough. For example, the color of the light of the caverns made a huge, huge difference.
If you had a combination of red and yellow in the tunnel, they slammed their brakes because they thought it was a fire in the tunnel. The conclusion is to avoid red and yellow colors in these rock caverns.
They also found that blue light that wakes people up, which is also to say that you're never supposed to look at your phones before bedtime because that blue light spectrum is found to delay the release of melatonin, which is the hormone that helps you fall asleep. So it's great for drivers, but not so great for sleepers. There's also a problem with the ventilation tunnels that are peppered throughout the journey on the side of the main tunnel. Now those were unlit, so they appeared as like giant black holes on the side of the road.
And when you're driving through the tunnel like that, all of a sudden you have a big black gap. We saw that one lady went like this, and several people went like this to avoid that big black hole. Today it's well lit, and people drive straight on.
Now, they even changed the shape of the caverns so that they were a bit more gradual, because they found that a soft, rounded entrance made it calmer for the drivers to transition into the new space. And it was also safer, because they could actually see what was coming in front of them. Now, blue light, trumpeted caverns might not sound like that much of a fix, but these were actually massive and big innovations in tunnel infrastructure. So remember, the Lardau Tunnel is the longest tunnel in the world. And before this, engineers didn't really have to incorporate human psychology on such a big scale. Now Gunnar, he literally paved the way for this field of work. And the result? Well, it's a seamless intersection of psychology, engineering, and art. The Lardau Tunnel even has a bit of Gunnar's imagination in it as well.
Well, first tunnels I made was snow tunnels. Growing up on the border of Norwegian mountains, we stayed out at night in snow caverns, and kind of that light that sifts through in the morning. Maybe that's part of what we have in our tunnel. I had big books as a child of the wonderful technologies of the world, which was black and white pictures. Now I put color to the unedited film of the tunnels.
Yes, so that is what this work means to him. And after all that hard work, when Gunnar finally rode through the tunnel on the simulator, well, he was completely blown away.
It was fabulous to drive through the tunnel for the first time. See the spaciousness, see the light, the blue light far off, giving you the feeling that, maybe it's the end of the tunnel. But when you get near to it, you see it's not the end, but it's spacious. It's kind of like the morning sky above you. When you come into it, it's like it's glittering. It's like it's gems in the rock. It's fantastic. But it vanishes after time. You adjust to the light and the magic disappears. And that's good because we don't want people to stop there. We want them to pass through.
If you think that Gunnar's romanticizing this tunnel a bit much, well, he is not the only one.
After the Lardau tunnel was finished, before it opened for traffic, there was a couple that got married in one of these rock caverns. It was beautiful. They had put up tables, there was music. It was a beautiful event. And they wanted to do it here in the rock caverns of the Lardau tunnel. That's beautiful.
Now, some couples want beach weddings and some want to get married in an old mansion. But a couple getting married in a road tunnel, that is definitely a first. But the Lardau tunnel, well, it's not like any other tunnel. It's a tunnel that was built for people. And Scandinavian design is about making things that are not only beautiful, but also functional. The Lardal Tunnel, it opened in 2000. And in 19 years, there's only been one serious accident. And it wasn't because of the design of the tunnel. It was actually a drunk driving accident. Now, this tunnel design was so successful that other countries, well, they are following Norway's lead. After visiting the Lardal Tunnel a few times, the Chinese government reached out to Gunnar's team for a similar project. Now, they wanted to build the world's longest twin-tube tunnel in northwest China. Like the Lardal Tunnel, it would have run through a huge, huge mountain range. But they also had just a little bit of a special request for Gunnar as well. They wanted the tunnel to look Chinese to Westerners, but look Western to the local Chinese population. I know, what a puzzle. They settled on a design that included caverns with palm trees, clouds on the ceilings, and grass to give the illusion of being outside. Now this is just another example of how Norwegians and Scandinavians have brought their ideas around the world. From the Vikings conquering Europe to Snowshoe Thompson bringing skis to California.
Well, Norway has high mountains, deep fjords, we have harsh weather. It led us to, the Vikings made wonderful ships that could take a storm and led us to explore the world. We've had the explorers going to the South Pole, the North Pole. You have to dare, and then you have to deliver. And that's part of the culture, and I think that's some of the crux here.
Yes. So if Vikings were actually symbols of daring exploration and brilliant innovation, well, I think you can kind of call Gunnar a tunnel Viking as well.
Tunnel Viking, maybe. Maybe that's a new term. Haven't heard that one before.
This region, well, it is filled with people like Gunnar. And our next story, well, it's no different. Because if Gunnar was trying to move a mountain, our next subject was trying to move the sun. And for this story, we take you to Rjukan, which is about 3 hours west of Oslo. Now, Rjukan is a small town with less than 4,000 residents, and it's located in a valley between some of Norway's most beautiful mountains. The landscape, it is incredible. And here's Martin Anderson, an artist who moved to Rjukan in 2002.
I always had this impression of Rjukan that it has some sort of magic. It's a very narrow valley, just 500 meters wide. It's surrounded with one wall on each side. So when you see, you always see into something. You never look at the horizon. It's never this eternity when you are in the valley. And it's a very dramatic place. It's a very three-dimensional place. That's a part of the magic here, I think.
So, there's a catch. Being surrounded by such dramatic mountains means that the citizens of Rjukan, well, they don't get much sun. From around October to March, the sun is hidden by the mountains, so that's basically half the year. Now, people in town, they would chase the sun by visiting the next town over and going up a cable car. But for the most part, they lived in darkness. That's the way it was. Then, as many stories often begin, a stranger comes into town. Martin Anderson, whose voice you just heard, he was born in Norway, but he spent most of his life globetrotting. So from Rome to Berlin to Mali, and somehow he ends up in little Rjukan. Well, actually not somehow. Martin's parents lived there, and he and his wife wanted to raise their children in the countryside. So they moved to this little town, and Martin, well, he really liked the place. Except for one thing. It's probably you already guessed it, the sun, or lack thereof. Now when Martin moved there, the sun hit the center of the valley and life was great. He could go outside drinking those good vitamin D rays. But when the seasons changed and the sun started to dip lower and lower and lower at the horizon, you know, in the summer days, it gets longer, but in the winter, they get shorter. And all of that is because of the tilt of the Earth. Now, in the summertime, the sun is higher in the horizon, traveling further across the sky. But in winter, it dips low. And the further north one goes, the lower the sun dips. So in northern Norway, for example, there are places where the sun never ever rises in the winter. In Ryokan, where Martin lives, the sun dipped low in the winter and was blocked by the mountains surrounding the town. Now, as the seasons changed, Martin would hike up the hills just to get a glimpse of the sun.
To see the sun disappear was very problematic to me. Yeah, each sunny day I was chasing it and looking for the sun just to spend some minutes in the sun.
And the lack of the sun wasn't just a problem for Martin. It was actually a huge problem for the whole town.
There's a big difference in how people relate in the dark times and in the summer times, yes. In the summer times, it's much more vibrant, everybody's more happy, everybody's more outgoing. And in the winter time, people are more like bears, they stay more inside. Most of them, they have a cabin up in the mountain. They spend their free time outside town. So that's also a bit sad in relation to a town that everybody disappears it to spend their free time.
And then one day, while he was out sun chasing, he got an idea. What if you put giant mirrors on the mountain to reflect the sun down into town? Okay, I know this sounds like something from a Superman villain plot, but Martin